Hey, Minnesota wrestling coaches and members of the Coaches Association. I'm Kip Lynk, the executive director of the Minnesota Wrestling Coaches Association. And we're trying something new here with the Coaches Association. We're going to make a little video podcast. We may also try to turn it into a podcast you could get on Spotify or Anchor or other methods. But for now, we're on going to be on YouTube. We have our own YouTube channel. And with the MWCA being a grassroots type of organization, that we have deadlines and different things that we have to meet when we're submitting things to the Minnesota State High School League. It's either February 15th for policy changes, but if they're bigger bylaw changes, those are an October 15th deadline. And our advisory is constantly working to hear from our coaches and our organizations, our sections, our section reps, and bringing proposals forward. And back in October, when we had our fall clinic, I mentioned we had some coaches that were bringing forth the idea of looking at our classifications. How do we identify our schools for class AAA, AA, and A? And we weren't sure about timing for this year and if we could all get it all in and do all those things. And that we're still in that boat, but we want to be able to have a conversation and be able to bring to you data and explain the data and the rationale of what that is before we ask you to give input and to vote on it. And so as we record here tonight in early January, I am joined by Joe Puncochar, the coach and AD at Howard Lake Waverly Winstead. And tonight's topic is that classification. So Joe, first, thank you for taking so much time and effort into this particular topic, doing some research, pulling the data, and bringing it available to us as coaches.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kip.
So Joe has taken a look at, he looked at last time's rotation. So 2 years ago when the rotations for the sections and the classifications was set. And currently Minnesota operates under the largest 64 schools go to class AAA. The next 96 go to AA, and then all the rest go to A. There was a time, I guess maybe it was more than 20 years ago, that it was a third, and a third. And the gap between the largest AAA school and the smallest AAA school got to be very large. And then this formula kind of came into be. And so, Joe, I'm going to let you just kind of kick off the conversation tonight on why you believe, and you've convinced me, I'll add that in there, why you believe the current way of doing this is a problem. Why is it that the next it's about AA, why the next 96 is a problem?
Well, Kip, over the last, 20, 30 years, maybe longer, I don't know. Obviously, we've seen a lot of programs, wrestling programs in Minnesota, either, fold up shop with consolidations of school districts, or form cooperative agreements with other schools, just because they are no longer able to field a team anymore. And so the number of wrestling programs altogether has continued to decline. And with this classification method, as the number of programs decline, we're going to see the number of teams in Class A decline because we don't work from the bottom up, we work from the top down. And so we're taking those top 64 and then those next 96 and whatever's left. And so every time we see a AA program necessarily co-op with another AA program, or in some cases we have some AAA programs that are co-op with other AAA or other AA programs as well. Every time that happens, another Class A school gets pulled into AA, which continues to shrink shrink Class A. With that, we obviously, we're all aware of kind of this, the rural part of the state is continuing to struggle. The enrollment drops and things like that. And so we've lost those programs on the small side of things that, maybe used to exist back in, so you might remember like the Circle 8 conference. A lot of those, that's like 2 wrestling programs now that, that even have, access to their own wrestling teams. And so we see the continued decline of the number of teams in Class A, which of course weakens Class A, but also creates a larger gap from the largest AA school to the smallest AA school. And we're seeing traditional Class A schools now become the smallest Class AA schools, and they're nearly 4 times smaller than the largest Class AA school.
Yeah, when we first went to this formula, the 64, 96, and all the rest, Class A was actually the largest class in terms of number of teams. It was over 100 teams in that case. But like you said, as two maybe smaller AA schools, if they co-op and pair, now that 96 became 95. And so now they reach into Class A and pull up one. And so every time that happens, where a AA school becomes a part of a cooperative with another AA school, or a program is dropped, that's happened too, right? Like, so they just pull up the next largest. So in theory, a school that has been Class A could actually have declining enrollment and still be bumped up into AA because of that 64, 96, and then all the rest.
That is right. Yep.
So you have done some work here. I'm gonna pull up my screen share here and get some data that is up on the board for people to see. And it's really just a good breakdown of that information that you had. Using our current formula, if you want to just stop or start and just kind of share
Yep.
how the breakdown of how we're reading this grid.
Sure, absolutely. So if you're looking at the left-hand side of the spreadsheet, the current system is on the top left, and it explains the 64, 96, and remaining. If you look at the columns to the right of the class sizes, you'll notice the enrollment. So that's the largest enrollment and the smallest enrollment per class. And then maybe the most confusing number up there is that difference column. And that difference column is the difference between the smallest and largest school. So like the 2.5, the big long decimal, the smallest school in AAA is 2.5 times smaller than the largest school. And if you look at AA, we're at 3.8 or so, and then single A 2.9. And so you have that, those gaps in size really apparent there. And these numbers I took straight from the High School League website. This is their Minnesota State High School League enrollment number. So these are not raw numbers. This is already with like the free and reduced benefit that's already been considered by the High School League, and that's included. And I think it's really important to note, that there's two underlying things that I'm really not going to get into tonight. But some people have talked about the co-op rule and the free and reduced rule having an effect on classes and so on. And there's difference in opinion on whether or not they should be or they shouldn't. But in all reality, the co-op rule and the free and reduced rule impact all activities in the Minnesota State High School League, not just wrestling. And so if wrestling tries to make some changes with that, that's probably going to fall on deaf ears because we're not going to be able to.
And quite honestly, it doesn't change the math of what we're talking about. It changes which schools have those numbers, right? Like there's going to be a smallest AA school and there's going to be a largest Class A school. That doesn't change. It just changes which school it might be. So even if we got into that, right, like that becomes a more direct impact on specific programs, where this is talking about the overall piece, that it's not going to change the gap between the largest and the smallest. No. But when we get into those types of things.
Sure isn't. And if you want to compare us to other current 3-class sports that are using a 3-class system, you can look in that middle area of the spreadsheet. And I was able to pull and go through all of that as well to just look at the number of teams for each class. And, trying to compare wrestling to other sports is kind of apples to oranges. But looking at sports like maybe a cross country, a track and field, golf, those are all individual sports that, you could maybe make a simple argument that they're similar. But like a cross country team and a golf team, you only need, 5 members of a team, where obviously currently wrestling, we need 14 as the way it stands right now. Track and field's a little bit more of a comparable, I think, just because, there's 18 events and, requires maybe more members to compete as a team. But they have a whole different, they don't have duels per se that determines a Minnesota High School League, championship. And so that you can make an argument there that it doesn't matter as much either. But when you look at those other ones and you look at Class A, you look at cross country and track and field specifically, they are, Class A is by far the largest class. In cross country, it's twice the size of Class AA. And in track and field, it's almost 3 times the size. And if you look at the difference in the size of the programs, you'll notice in both of those, it's Class A has the biggest gap. It's not AA, it's not AAA, it's Class A that has the larger gap in size from, the smallest to the biggest. If you look at the other ones, there's other systems that are a third. There's a few others that have caps. Anything under a certain number, I believe like a soccer has a cap, anything under like a 600 something is Class A. That there's different ways that can be done. And some of that data was harder to pull and kind of sift through. There isn't any examples that, use
you froze, Joe, so we'll have to go back and check the recording here as we go. And so while we're waiting for Joe to return,
schools.
Oh, so you froze there, Joe. So I need you to after you're talking about soccer. So
Okay.
we'll go ahead and pick that part up again.
Okay. I guess I was just saying that the scenarios that would be possible changes that might eliminate some of this continued shrinkage of Class A can be found underneath, the current data that I have there. And so these are all just samples. I think there's 5 of them there. You could, create it from the bottom up. You could do a third again. You could do half and half underneath the top 64 teams to try to balance out AA and single A. So there's the same number of programs. There's a lot of different ways to do it. But I think the numbers you have to really look at is the difference in the number of teams in each class, as well as the size difference. And so if you're looking at trying to make it equal in terms of how big is the small schools compared to the big school in that class, you'd look at the half and half, which would be sample 2. That would potentially be one you could look at, as well as the third one, which we had previously, which maybe going back to what we had before isn't what we're looking at doing. But I still think it needs, it's worthy of being addressed. So
yeah, well, and wrestling, you mentioned wrestling is apples to oranges when we're comparing some other sports, and even within our own organization, it's a challenge because are we an individual sport or are we a team sport, right? And the answer is we're both, but all of our programs put different priorities on each. And that complicates this a little bit too, because while we are having conversation around the number of weight classes and whether it's 12, 13, or 14 is, I don't want to say irrelevant, but that's not really part of this equation, because no matter which of those options we choose, that's the largest starting lineup of any sport. And you have to have people slotted into specific weight classes. So as our schools get smaller and that enrollment gets smaller, filling a varsity roster, especially, some of our smaller schools that also have hockey in the wintertime, or sometimes even have boys swimming, and I'm talking just the small schools, right? Like, to fill a full roster is a challenge. And so if we see ourselves as a team sport and duals are highly important, then enrollment matters. And so, the other piece of this conversation that has kind of come up at different times is if we're talking about fairness in terms of how we do the classification, is fairness that each class has the same number of schools, or is fairness that each class has the same gap, or roughly the same gap from the largest to the smallest in enrollment? Because we also know that in many of our sections, whether it's Class A or Class AAA, we have some teams that are full and some teams that are not. So let's go ahead and take a look at those numbers here on the left column of some of the possible changes. And these were all, we're not stuck on any one of these at this point. There's other options that maybe are potentially sitting out there, but just kind of running through some possible scenario changes of like that sample one, you have the largest 64, the next 80, and then all the rest, which ends up being 95. Why 80? Why was that the number that was chosen there?
I just did 10 teams a section. AAA is 8 teams a section. I know that 64 number was sought after when we went to 64, 96, and the rest originally. So I wanted to leave AAA alone in that sample. And then by increasing the size of single A, we go back to kind of how it was when we first went to 64, 96, and the rest is making Class A bigger than AA. If we don't go to anything less than 80, if you go to 88, well, you're at half and half. So I was trying to go even number of teams per section, and 10 just happened to be an easy number there.
Okay. So then as we do move down to the next sample of a possibility, and as you mentioned, this one actually gets us a little bit as close as we can to parity between A and AA in terms of that gap. One of the challenges we'll always have is if we try to move that 64 number to being a third for the largest schools, is that gap could continue to grow too. There's a big difference between 800 student difference and a 1600 student difference, which we start getting into when we expand that AAA larger than 64. But so sample 2 is the 64 and then splitting the remaining teams in half.
Right. And that gets our difference to be pretty close, 3.4 roughly for AA and single A. So that would create that idea of fair potentially in the size of the schools you're competing against in each of your classes.
And the other piece that also does is it kind of it helps eliminate part of the problem that you explained at the beginning, right? Like if 2 AA schools co-op in the 96, it pulls the next school up. In this case, it may not touch it because it's going to take a couple of pairings before the half gets skewed. That potentially
every pairing doesn't have an automatic effect right away.
Automatic effect, right? And then moving down to sample 3, that was just a straight a third, and a third.
Right. I just figured people might want to see what it would look like for if we were all even, and how that would impact things.
And there are some coaches that will ask that question: why don't all of our classes have the same number of schools?
And I think the simple answer to that is when you look at most other sports, that doesn't happen anywhere else really. The biggest class typically has the smallest number of teams. I mean, that's why I think about football went to 7 classes, 6A is 32. And you can look at other sports as well, it'll be the same. There is a few examples where the 4-class and 5-class systems where like the top 2 classes have the same number of teams, and then it changes. But none of the 3-class sports is AAA, smaller, and only one of them is at the same size.
Okay. And then sample 4, it's kind of a reverse of our current method. It's got the largest 64, and then you take the next 96 from the bottom, which in theory would kind of create some of those, it could create some of those same gaps that we currently see in reverse a couple years down the line, as if a couple A schools pair, now you're going to be pulling some more AA schools down.
Right. And that could potentially create a larger gap in the Class A. One thing I'd like to point out about sample 4 is if you look at the current track,
we've got a freeze again here. And again, I don't know if it's me or you, Joe. You froze on me again, Joe. So I don't know if you can hear me right now.
Apparently my Wi-Fi doesn't want to cooperate tonight, I guess.
Yeah. You were
Howard.
Yeah. So sample 4, you just said that what I like about sample, or what I want to explain about sample 4, not what I like. What I want to explain about sample 4.
Yeah. The one thing about sample 4, I think an interesting comparison is track and field has similar difference breakdown as sample 4. So when you look at their the size of the current track and field based off of these numbers, the Class A is the biggest gap by, quite a bit. Just like the gap here. I'm not saying I like this one better than any of the other ones. I just think there's somebody out there that's doing something similar to this with this big of gaps.
Yeah. So, and the one thing that, and then the last one you did is you'd pick some enrollment caps. You did the largest 64, and then you said class AA ends at 400. Once anybody below 400 would be class A.
Right. And with the current numbers, that would be very similar to the 80 being the new AA number being 80, and then the rest being
closer. And all of these could have some pros and cons. But as you kind of look and think about these, if you chose the 64, then the smallest 96, and then all the rest being in AA, right? Like that AA number of schools is going to get smaller over time.
Right.
It just will. Like with any time there's a co-op or a program lost, that's the number that's going to be most impacted, is going to be that AA. So it's the exact situation you got going on now. The 64, 80, that one, it'll always be 80 in the middle. So again, the class A number might potentially get smaller. The only one that I don't want to say holds true over time. We'll have to keep having this conversation potentially on everyone other than maybe the 64 half and half. Yeah. Because then AA and A will shrink at the same rate. So, Joe, I really appreciate your time on this. And I know as a coaches association, our advisory is looking at this. I'm expecting there's going to be some kind of survey coming out to coaches sometime in the next couple of weeks, hopefully, around, do you believe that this is a pertinent issue that we need to address right now? And if so, which of these options kind of seem to ring true with you? And I'm hoping we'll get coaches to watch this videos, because it's enlightening just to hear the conversation and the rationale of why, but even to understand what the numbers are on there. So I really want to thank you for your time on not only being here tonight, but pulling all this together. But I also want to give you a chance to share any other thoughts or things that we maybe have not touched on yet tonight on this initial MWCA podcast.
I just want to let it be known that I'm happy to share any of this data with other coaches. I've looked at other things, comparing us as an individual sport or a team sport, and questions you may have. I may already have done the digging, and I'm certainly glad to share that information that I found, and certainly glad to have conversation, agree or disagree. And so feel free to reach out to me, and we can continue the dialogue. I'm more than happy to share anything that I've dug up. So.
And, just again, this is a reminder that the Coaches Association, we are a grassroots organization. We do have layers in place to help deal with how we submit policy and trying to do what's best for the sport across the whole state, not necessarily just Metro or just AAA or just A. That we have equal representation on our advisory board in terms of Class A members, AA members, and AAA members. We have equal representation on our section reps. And so if you have something that you think needs to be shared, really the best way is to go through your section rep. And when our section reps get together, they share that information, and advisory is always there listening as well. So if there's nothing else to add, Joe, we'll call this a wrap on our first attempt at a Minnesota Wrestling Coaches Association podcast.
Awesome. Thanks again for having me, Kip.
Thanks, Joe.